In our study of Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we have seen that the approach required is not so much an intellectual, rational understanding, but an intuitive feel. And the method by which the Vedic knowledge is to be received was to listen in soul to the old voices and allow the Shruti in the soul to respond, to vibrate first obscurely in answer to the Vedic hymn of knowledge, to give the response, the echo, and last, to let that response gain in clarity, intensity, and fullness. And it is this approach that Sri Aurobindo himself leads us into this study and with which we follow also. In the first discussion that we had, we read Sri Aurobindo's translation of the first verse and had some sense of the symbol of this gigantic horse of the worlds. Now, in the passage we are reading, Sri Aurobindo goes to an elaboration of this imagery. He offers us once again the translation and then begins to explain what it represents. But in the approach he takes at first, he has to tap into the modern mind and the mold of the modern mind and gradually lead it into the more intuitive perception of this description. So we go through the rhythm of what he leads us to. First, he says, the Upanishad begins with a grandiose abruptness in an impetuous figure of the horse of the Ashwamedha. This whole section he titles The Horse of the Worlds. And it begins with a grandiose abruptness. There is no gradual lead-in. We are suddenly face to face with this gigantic, grandiose figure. And it is the horse, capital H, because it is not a physical material form. It is the cosmos. It is the divine himself moving to manifest himself as the cosmos that is described. And horse of the Ashwamedha. In the first verse, this word Ashwa and Medha appears. The Ashwa is the horse, as we have seen. Medha is the sacrifice. So you will recall the first phrase of the verse, Om Ushava Ashvasya Medhasya Shiraha. Usha is the dawn, is Ashvasya of the horse, Medhasya of the sacrifice, Shira, head. And Sri Aurobindo now translates this. Om, it begins. Dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. And he continues with the whole of the verse. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. His wide open mouth is fire, the universal energy. And so on. I will read the whole text, but first, in order to fully appreciate, we will try to put ourselves already, anticipating his later elaboration, we will try to put ourselves already in that frame of vision, perception, in which as we read this description, we can glimpse something of what the rishis saw. You will recall in our earlier discussion, Sri Aurobindo had explained that Ashwa means originally being, existence, substance, and from the sense of speed and strength it came to mean horse. And therefore this description is of the cosmic being, the Virat Purusha, Brahman manifest as the material universe. It's the cosmic being moving forward with speed, with power, and it is sheer existence, being, substance, moving into manifestation. And that is Ashva, horse. Usha, we know it as the name of the goddess of dawn in the Veda, but later Sri Aurobindo will explain the deeper root from which this word comes, and it means, he says, coming into manifested being. It can also mean desire or yearning. So the Usha or dawn to the early thinkers, and I'm reading from a later portion of the text, Usha or dawn to the early thinkers was the impulse towards manifest existence. So this horse is the movement of the divine moving into material manifestation, and the head of that, the front portion, is this impulse, the push forward, yearning, desiring, but much more coming into manifestation. So you see in this a being moving into a becoming, and the front of that movement of becoming is the head of the horse sacrificial. But why is it sacrificial? And the deeper sense of this will follow later. But for now we will recall simply that Sri Aurobindo speaks of the whole universe as emerging from the sacrifice of the divine, who accepts to move into this self-loss from his high, great freedom and bliss of Satchidananda. He moves to as if give himself up and break himself into this material manifest universe. And this is the divine sacrifice with which the universe is born. So the horse sacrificial suggests this sense of the movement to manifest, but also to lose himself into manifestation as a sacrifice. But there's a more profound sense to it. The sacrifice is a loose translation in English. The way Sri Aurobindo explains it in the Synthesis of Yoga or in his essays on the Gita, it is this whole movement of the divine power, the divine force pouring itself out into itself as a movement of manifestation, as a flow. And it is this which is the true sense of sacrifice. So the horse sacrificial is this movement of the divine to move, to come into manifestation, and as a power that pours out into itself, unfolding, manifesting, taking form, and so on. And of that, the frontal portion is this movement of Usha. Then, the sun is his eye. And the eye, also we have seen earlier, because the sun is master of sight. Sight in the Veda was the seeing of the reality, the seeing of the divine as he sees himself to be, and therefore becomes what he sees himself to be. So when he moves into manifestation, he sees what he wants to become, or rather he sees what he is already within himself, and what he wants to move into becoming. And so the seeing is the sight that leads the whole forward movement, and it is obviously at the frontal portion of the head. As the head, Usha, dawn, moves into manifestation, there has to be the seeing of what is to be manifested. And these are the eyes. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. And the breath, where air is the basis of life, air as Vayu, the principle of movement, contact, one of the great five, as we call it, elements, but tattvas, beingnesses, literally translated. This movement of expansion, contraction, energy in movement, force manifesting, that is the breath of this cosmic horse. And his wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. And fire here is the strength and the expansion, but a universal movement that gives the form and concretizes the form. This initial description we will use as our starting point. As we read Sri Aurobindo's complete translation, we will dwell on this. I want also to show how the same text could be translated in different ways. In the original tradition of the Vedic learning, they speak of 3 levels in which the Veda can be received or understood. There is the Adhyatmik, which is the highest spiritual, Adhidaivik, which is the psychological or dealing with divine beings or cosmic powers, and there is the Adhibhautik, which is the material, overt, obvious translation. Sri Aurobindo obviously here is trying to reach out to the modern mind and must necessarily present this third level, which is the Adhibhautik, the form which we can recognize. And he then leads us from there to the higher 2 levels of interpretation and understanding. So in the obvious translation is what we have read, the material form. And the other 2 levels are, if I were to translate in a very loose way, not very accurately, and Usha being the movement into manifestation, we would say, Om, the movement into manifestation is the front of the being, existence, substance that sacrifices itself. If we translate in this way, you can see how the whole thing is a spiritual description of the divine as he moves to manifest. If you take a more symbolic representation with the powers of the cosmos, we would say, Usha, the power of dawn, the power of manifestation, is at the front of the whole manifestation of the cosmos. The head, Shira, the word used for head is Shira. It means also peak or front or top. We say the peak of the mountain is the Shira, the top of the temple is the Shira, the head is the Shira. So the frontal part of this body of the divine manifestation is Usha, as the goddess, as a conscious power who lights up and reveals in the dawning of that which is still unmanifest as it moves from darkness into manifestation. And then there is the most material, obvious form of translation with exactly the same words, where we say, dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. In the same way, for the next portion, the sun is his eye, his breath is the wind, his wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. We could have translated at the highest adhyatmic level, we would say that sun here is Surya. Surya, you will remember from our earlier study of the Upanishad that Sri Aurobindo describes Surya from the root sounds, the sense of spreading out. To move into this widening, spreading movement, and the sun is the source from which the light moves into manifestation, and therefore one of the names of the sun is Surya. And if we take this sense, Suryas Chakshu, sun is his eye. Surya Chakshu, Chakshu is the eye, the seeing. So we will say the spreading out movement is his seeing of himself into manifestation. Such would be the kind of translation we would follow. The breath here, we will say the life force is what he breathes into the movement. The open mouth, and we will see the sense of the open mouth, is the casting out into form, the power of Agni, by which the whole universe is given its permanence of form. So with this kind of a background, we will read the whole translation and keep behind it this deeper sense that each of the things described is a power in the general larger movement of the divine manifestation. An aspect, a power, symbolically attached to the images of the horse and its form. And remember, Om is Brahman himself fourfold. So, Om, it begins. Dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. His wide open mouth is fire, the universal energy. Time is the self of the horse sacrificial. So now in this larger movement, he brings the unfolding sense, which is time. Time is the self of the horse sacrificial. And you can see the cosmos spans so many gradations. So next, heaven is his back, and the mid-region is his belly. Earth is his footing. The quarters, the four sides, the quarters are his flanks, and their intermediate regions between the quarters, the eighth, their intermediate regions are his ribs. The seasons are his members. So as the horse moves, if you were to watch from a point, as the horse moves, you would see the front and then the mid and then the tail, and you will see passing through rhythmically of different changing passages of the seasons. And this is of course much more profound, as we will see later. The seasons are not merely the seasons that we see of the change of the temperature and climate, but they are also rhythmically the cycles of the divine manifestation as he moves through, we will say, 4 cycles of the yugas. But the seasons are also symbolic of that. So the seasons are his members. The months and the half months are that on which he stands. Their joints, the days and nights, are that on which he stands. The stars are his bones, and the sky is the flesh of his body. The strands are the food in his belly. The rivers are his veins. The mountains are his liver and lungs. Herbs and plants are the hairs of his body. The rising day is his front portion, and the setting day is his hinder portion. We will see later, as there is this movement to enter manifestation, the rising day, of course now obvious with Usha as the dawn, the front portion is where the whole push of manifestation is concentrated. But as the divine moves to further manifest, what has been manifested gradually slides back into the hind. The hind is also where what is digested by the horse is left and thrown behind. But it is also the dark, not the daylight, but the darkening of the evening. Because as the divine moves forward, what he leaves behind as the past fades into oblivion, into darkness, ceases to be held in manifestation. But at the back, there is a gradual trailing off. In the front, there is this tremendous, impetuous, abrupt force which breaks through. And so the front of the horse and the back are seen in this way. The rising day is his front portion and the setting day is his hinder portion. When he stretches himself, then it lightens. There is lightning. When he shakes himself, then it thunders. And we will see it's not merely the physical lightning and thunder, which are also included in this image, but something far more profound. When the cosmic substance, the material, physical existence of the material world itself, when that is stretched, when that is concentrated, when that is put under tension, you have immediately the release of heat, light, and electricity. It is a profound truth which we will see on a spiritual level, on a psychological level, and even at a physical level in the reality of matter. So it is an extraordinary statement, or it captures so much in a single image. We will see even the physics of heat, light, and electricity are captured in this description. And the thunder, similarly. When he urines, then it rains. Speech verily is the voice of him. Day was the grandeur that was born before the horse as he galloped. The eastern ocean gave it birth. Night was the grandeur that was born in his rear, and its birth was in the western waters. These were the grandeurs that arose into being on either side of the horse. And the oceans here are, as we have seen before, domains of consciousness. And what does the horse do? A horse is not complete unless the horse carries something with it. It's not merely his movement, he must carry the rider. And now 4 names or 4 aspects of the horse are described, and what they carry. Each of these 4 aspects of the cosmic horse. He became higher and carried the gods. Vajin and bore the Gandharvas. These are the divine beings who preside over the arts, the sciences, and knowledge as it moves from the cosmic station to the more specific forms into manifestation. Then Arvan and bore the Titans, Ashva and carried mankind. So you see 4 levels of beings as they are carried by the cosmic horse in the forward evolutionary movement. The sea was his brother and the sea his birthplace. So with this he ends the translation of the first verse. And now he begins to describe, and he must first access the mind of the humanity as it is, and explain to it what we should look for and how we should avoid getting confused by such a complex image. This passage, full of a gigantic imagery, sets the key to the Upanishad, and only by entering into the meaning of its symbolism can we command the gates of this many-mansioned city of Vedantic thought. Sri Aurobindo himself uses an imagery here to convey something more profound than merely words would have. That the Vedantic thought is a city. It includes everything of life. It represents everything of life. And to each of those things it gives a deeper spiritual perception. But the city itself is many-mansioned. You can enter into different rooms and find it richly full, and move into a different room and find it differently arranged, differently rich. And you can go from room to room, and in each you can be completely lost and say, this is it, this is all, I have found it. But the treasures are not complete unless the entire mansion and the many mansions are known. So the city includes many mansions, each of which has many rooms, each of which has as if a complete vision. And you can see there is a suggestion of 3 levels of understanding. To the more narrow mental consciousness, which sees only one thing at a time, the exploration of a single room is itself quite overwhelming because there is so much there. But to a mind which is widened, opening to higher realities, it sees the many rooms of a single mansion. But it sees the mansion itself and says, this is my philosophy, this is my truth. But the truly liberated mind sees many mansions, many facets, many approaches to the oneness of the divine truth. And it can include them all in its vision. So for entering and exploring this many-mansioned city of Vedantic thought, we must first enter into this meaning of the symbolism, and through that, this forms like the gate to enter into the city itself. He says, there is never anything merely poetic or ornamental in the language of the Upanishads. And this is how, in the traditional study, you were taught to meditate on the verse, to get the general sense, and then to meditate on each word, and then meditate on the placements of the words. Why this word and not that word? Why this placement and not that placement? And in this way, an inquiry would lead you to deeper and deeper insights. And we assume that nothing is by chance, nothing is mere decoration or mere poetry. Each sound, each symbol, each, in the English language, comma or full stop is significant. And this is how Sri Aurobindo himself presents things. Even in this passage, which would at first sight seem to be sheer imagery, there is a choice, a selecting eye, an intention in the images. They are all dependent not on the author's unfettered fancy, but on the common ideas of the early Vedantic theosophy. Theosophy here is the exploration of the nature of the divine. But on the common ideas of the early Vedantic theosophy. And so there is no author's unfettered fancy. And yet these common ideas of early Vedantic theosophy are not common anymore to us. And so we are as if aliens entering a domain which we do not know at all, and then trying to communicate with men of great wisdom. It is fortunate also that the attitude of the Upanishad to the Vedic sacrifices is perfectly plain from this opening. There are other texts where the symbolism or the spiritual foundations are not so obvious, and it is easy to interpret those verses in very materialistic, reductionist terms. But here, it's obvious there's something extraordinary, something grand here. The moment he says, time is the self of the horse sacrificial, it's obvious at that point that this is not a mere allegory or symbol or a material form of horse. It is something which is cosmic. It's obvious there. We shall not stand in danger of being accused of reading modern subtleties into primitive minds, or of replacing barbarous superstitions by civilized mysticism. The Ashwamedha, or horse sacrifice, is, as we have seen, taken as the symbol of a great spiritual advance, an evolutionary movement almost out of the dominion of apparently material forces into a higher spiritual freedom. The horse of the Ashwamedha is, to the author, a physical figure representing, like some algebraic symbol, an unknown quantity of force and speed. He's drawing an analogy with algebra, and it is worth dwelling on what this conveys. In the approach of modern mathematics, we have this particular process called algebra, in which there is an unknown quantity, a mystery, an unknown value, number, object, quality, which we have to find by certain external indicators. So when I present this to little children, I will present it as a puzzle. We are going to solve a mystery. And the mystery is to find who did it. And we have so many indications. When he stepped on the soil, there was a foot imprint. When he touched the wall, there was a mark there. When we moved an object, it was at a certain height. And all of these indicate to us something of the person that we are trying to know. And it is in this way that algebra reveals through a process the thing which is unknown from the indications which point to that. So I am thinking of a number. When it is doubled and you triple it again, then it becomes 12. What is that number? And you see the symbols, the signs and the clues, and you follow them backwards, and as if unravel to find, it's this number 2, or this power, this quality. So in the symbol of the algebraic process, there is an unknown quantity which is represented by a symbol X. And then we arrange the known things around it, and through a certain process, through the known, we capture the unknown. So he says, the horse of the Ashwamedha is, to the author, a physical figure representing, like some algebraic symbol, an unknown quantity of force and speed. And yet it's a physical figure. It is the material universe itself. But what is the nature of its power, its force, its speed, its origin, its purpose, its unfolding? And this is the unknown quantity which we are going to capture through these symbols. From the imagery, it is evident that this force, this speed, is something worldwide, something universal. It fills the regions with its being. It occupies time. It gallops through space. It bears in its speed men and gods and the titans. It is the horse of the worlds, and yet the horse sacrificial. And he continues, let us regard first the word Ashva and consider whether it throws any light on the secret of this image. Ashva, commonly known as horse. For we know that the early Vedantins attached great importance to words in both their apparent and their hidden meaning, and no one who does not follow them in this path can hope to enter into the associations with which their minds were full. And this is the beauty of the original language. In Sanskrit, you have these multiple levels of meaning. But particularly in the way the Vedantic rishis used it, there was an apparent meaning and then there was a hidden meaning. The apparent meaning was the material form of the spiritual experience. The hidden meaning was accessible only in a non-material, refined consciousness. So even in the speech, the rishis as if addressed all the levels to the most material manifestation and arising to the highest spiritual essential sense. They addressed all these levels in a single formulation of speech. To them, when the words were spoken, they did not see it as two different domains. Oh, we keep a secret language, we keep the profane language for those people who don't understand. They saw the whole thing as different levels of manifestation, which were all captured in the speech in a single statement. So when they spoke, even if they dwelt more on the higher spiritual sense, the material sense of it they saw not as a cover to hide, but the form of its material expression. And just as Brahman is not complete unless you know him fourfold, so the spiritual experience is not fully manifested and expressed in language unless it captures this fourfold expression. The three lower forms, the fourth, of course, is inexpressible, pure, essential experience, and therefore fourfold. But this aspect of hidden meaning and apparent meaning is critical to our deeper understanding. Yet the importance of associations in coloring and often determining our thoughts, determining even philosophic and scientific thought, when it is most careful to be exact and free, should be obvious to the most superficial psychologist. So we see the importance here of associations in coloring and in therefore carrying more profound layers of the sense. He refers now to one of the early modern Vedic commentators. He says, Swami Dayananda's method with the Vedas, although it may have been too vigorously applied and more often out of the powerful mind of the modern Indian thinker than out of the recovered mentality of the old Aryan rishis, would nevertheless, in its principle, have been approved by these Vedantins. So we see something very important. When the avatar comes to manifest a new consciousness, a new truth, he does not come alone. He is, after all, the Divine Godhead, and the Divine Godhead is multifaceted, with so many powers projecting out of him. And there are powers which are in front, there are powers which are on the side, and there are powers which are behind. We use the symbol of the cosmic horse. The frontal powers have to cut the way and prepare the ground for the avatar to step and manifest and imprint his work most successfully. And then there are those on the side who support the process, help him to express in different facets and forms more completely the great revelation and power that he brings. And then there are those who follow behind, who complete the process, tying up the loose ends and etc. And they are all his powers, aspects. So when we look at this very special manifestation that took place in the last 100 years of Sri Aurobindo appearing on earth, you see Mother describing it as what Sri Aurobindo represents in the world's history is not a teaching, not even a revelation. It is a decisive action direct from the Supreme. That decisive action has all these ripples and facets which flow around it. And you will see before his appearance a series of rapid preparatory steps. Extraordinary thinkers, philosophers, scientists, musicians, artists, creators, each one of them as if bursting out new possibilities, breaking new ground, so that when the power is fully impressed, there is the ready fertile soil in which all these different facets can be brought together, woven and raised to their spiritual peak. Swami Dayananda is one such who came, and he is known more as a social reformer, a religious reformer, etc. But he was an extraordinary being, an extraordinary vibhuti, as were all these great artists and musicians and philosophers and even political and military leaders. They prepared the ground, and the particular contribution of Swami Dayananda's method was to discard the purely ritualistic form in which the Vedic teaching had been surviving, and to go back to the deeper psycho-spiritual sense. And yet, because it was a preparatory effort, he had to limit himself with the more modern mental understanding of things. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo says, Swami Dayananda's method with the Vedas would nevertheless, in its principle, have been approved by these Vedantins. But what was the limitation? Too vigorously applied, more often out of the powerful mind of the modern Indian thinker than from the recovered mentality of the old Aryan. And this is the problem we will face ourselves in our study. We have the modern mental imprint, and we may make, even if it is a powerful imprint, we may apply it also in a certain limited way, or we may apply it too vigorously, as Swami Dayananda did. He interestingly read into one of the Vedic verses, I believe it was the Aditya Hridaya mantra, which is the solar heart, the mantra of the solar heart, loosely translated. He read into it even the physiology of the heart, the physical, biological human heart, and the description of its working inside the human body, and said, see, this was scientific knowledge. So, this is where Sri Aurobindo might say, too vigorously applied. Nevertheless, that is included perhaps as a secondary reflected meaning of what the Vedic rishis described as a cosmic heart, of which the human heart is obviously a symbol and a reflection, and therefore the interpretation in purely biological terms is acceptable, though it feels a little exaggerated and stretched from the deeper essential sense that it carries. But in this way, he and those inspired by him saw so much science and so much psychology in the Vedic verses, and it is interesting to observe that because they point to a higher knowledge, but they stop short because that was the nature of the modern thinker. The Aryan mentality has to be recovered. What it means is something very suggestive. If we look back at that period, which was much more intuitive, and we discussed this last time, there has been a kind of a fall, a decline from the intuitive mind to a more rational, intellectual mind. But the intuition is not lost because humanity dwelt on it for so long. That intuitive mind mentality of the old Aryan rishis is still there deep within us. If our bodies still retain the genes of our ancestors, and even going back to our ape-like ancestors, then surely our minds also retain the profoundly spiritual and intuitive imprint of those ancient rishis. Maybe lost in some corner deep inside, but still present. And that needs to be recovered. It is not something new that we have to form. It is something which was already there, which is as if covered up, which has to be drawn forward. And it is only with this recovered mentality of the Aryan rishis that we can fully appreciate this deep knowledge and live in its realizations. So Sri Aurobindo, having made that reference, moves on now to the root of the word Ashva. Now the word Ashva must originally have implied strength or speed or both before it came to be applied to a horse. So the question we can ask, if you go back to a primitive human condition where humanity begins to give names to objects, what would you name this? And why would you name it like that? If you ask yourself these questions, you will see always the naming process is an attempt to capture something unique of this. If I have before me 3 or 4 animals, I would want to catch the distinguishing character of this animal and name it by that. And so if you go back to the origins of all human language, you come to this principle that the name represents an essential character and power unique to that creature, to that form, to that object, or whatever it is. And here is also a spiritual truth. When a name is given, we are highlighting that aspect. We are also intensifying it, exaggerating it, bringing it forward into manifestation. I am digressing a little, but it is in this way that we will more profoundly understand the importance of the words and names used. When a human being is also named from a spiritual point of view, it is that uniqueness of that person, of the soul's character, aspiration, purpose in life, which is drawn out, highlighted and brought into manifestation. That's why the name was considered to be so important. Normally one would approach a spiritual being, someone who had the spiritual sight, to give the name. The person would look, and let's say in this case, the mother would look deep into the soul, see what was the soul's aspiration, sometimes for eternity, sometimes for this life, the particular purpose, the particular quality that it expressed, or the potentiality which it held, and that would be the name given. And so each time you call the person by that name, you intensify that vibration. You call into being, draw into manifestation that vibration. So in cases where the name represents something that the person has come to fulfill as an experience in life, each time the name is called, you are as if helping the person move deeper into that vibration. If it is a potential the person holds, the calling by that name helps to materialize that potential. But the same principle applies to any form to which we give a name. When the ancients saw this creature and saw the characteristic of the horse to be this tremendous strength and speed of strength, then the word with which they expressed those qualities became attached to horse, Ashva. It's not an arbitrary sound which is attached, but the sense. But now you see, the word is already known with that meaning, and now it is associated with this physical form, because also deep inside they see that this physical form embodies that quality. But now when they speak of Ashva, to their mind it is the speed and power. To our mind it is more the association with the material form of horse. To them both might be there, but the horse is secondary. It is only an external figure and symbol of this higher spiritual reality. So now the word Ashva must originally have implied strength or speed or both before it came to be applied to a horse. In its first or root significance, it means to exist pervadingly. So there is this existence which pervades in an immanence all over. And you see how this captures the sense of the Virat Purusha, the divine as material substance pervading the whole space and time. Its first root significance. Now, in the other text, Sri Aurobindo elaborates on this. There is a root sound. It has a first root significance, and then it has secondary implied significances. And then to that root sound, you have variations. So if you had ka, and ka will go ka, ka, ki, ku, each has variations. And to those variations, again, there are primary and secondary meanings, sometimes tertiary. And then there will be another attached sound to it. Again, there are a series of primary, secondary, but they all ripple out from this first primary sound, of which from or root sense, psychological sense, from which everything else as if derives by an extension. And this is how he explains the original language was formed. So in its first or root sounds, its first or root significance, it means to exist pervadingly, and so, now the secondary meaning, to possess, have, obtain, enjoy. It is the Greek ekho, Old Sanskrit asha. The ordinary word in Greek for I have. It means also, and even more commonly, so now we go into a third level of meaning, to eat or enjoy. So you can see how exist pervadingly becomes possess, have, and then by extension to obtain. And why do you obtain? Of course, to enjoy, to absorb, assimilate for enjoyment. So the common sense will be then to eat. You now obtain for the purpose of enjoyment, to eat or enjoy. Beside this original sense, inherent in the roots of its family, it has its own peculiar significance of existence in force, strength, solidity, sharpness, speed. And now he gives a series of indications of how he says this. In Ashan and Ashma, a stone, Ashani, a thunderbolt, Ashri, a sharp edge or corner, Latin, acer, acris, sharp, accus, point, etc. So you see how from this root sound all these derivatives emerge, and he's showing you across all these old languages there is a very clear connection, a common sense behind them all. And finally, Ashva, the strong, swift horse. Its fundamental meanings are therefore pervading existence, enjoyment, strength, solidity, speed. Shall we not say therefore that Ashva to the Rishis meant the unknown power made up of force, strength, solidity, speed and enjoyment that pervades and constitutes the material world? And you see how this captures the sense of the divine immanence. The power made up of force, strength, solidity, speed and enjoyment that pervades and constitutes the material world. Not only it fills everything in the pervading, but it is the very substance and reality of the material world. There is no material world if there is not this force and this movement of speed and the strength and solidity of that form and persistence, but also the enjoyment behind which supports this whole movement and play. So, Sri Sri Aurobindo moves further into justifying this position by looking at the later verses, which we will read next time. But just to complete this image, we skip a paragraph and look at what he says later. Dawn, says the Rishi, is the head of the horse sacrificial. Now the head is the front, the part of us that faces and looks out upon our world. And dawn is that part to the horse of the worlds. This goddess must therefore be the opening out to the world, to the eye of being. For as day is the symbol of a time of activity, night of a time of inactivity, so dawn images the imperfect but pregnant beginnings of regular cosmic action. It is the being, capital B, divine being. It is the being's movement forward. It is its impulse to look out at the universe in which it finds itself, and looking towards it, to yearn, to desire, to enter upon possession of a world which looks so bright because of the brightness of the gaze that is turned upon it. So with this we complete our study for today, and we have a sense of this great power that is moving in an impulse, looking out at the universe and unfolding the cosmic action. We can meditate on this image, and we will continue this text next Sunday. I will read in Sanskrit and then just the first few lines of the translation. Om Ushava Ashvasya Medhasya Shira. Om. Dawn is the head of the horse sacrificial. The sun is his eye. His breath is the wind. His wide open mouth is fire, the master might universal. Time is the self of the horse sacrificial.